Hello, and welcome to Klara's OpenZFS's newest features webinar. I'm your host, Allan Jude. I'm the CTO here at Klara, as well as a FreeBSD and OpenZFS developer. And I'll be taking your questions. So please enter those through the Zoom Q&A system, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. So getting started. A quick overview of what we'll discuss today. After an intro like we've just done, some of the features we'll talk about are the new special allocation classes or metadata vdevs that were added to OpenZFS and came from and how they apply. Then also provide some tips on selecting the right kind of device, hardware to use for your SLOG, your L2ARC, and metadata vdevs. And then in addition to your questions, we'll also talk about how the ZFS scrub system works and how that works differently depending on the layout of your pool. So ZFS has added quite a few interesting features in recent times. The one that I think we'll talk about most today is special vdevs. So this allows you to, in addition to the normal virtual devices that make up your pool of storage, you can have special classes of vdev that only hold certain types of data. So, the main use case is for metadata. So this separates all your metadata from your pool off onto a separate device that is maybe faster than the devices that make up the rest of your pool. But they can also be used specifically to store small blocks. And we'll be talking about when that might make sense. And another use case is for storing the dedupe table. Normally, the dedupe table is held in RAM and then also copied in the pool, and means anytime the dedupe table doesn't fit in memory, you have to fall back to the disk, and this can really hurt performance. But if the dedupe table lives on a dedicated disk that is much faster than your regular storage, it can mitigate that performance penalty. Another feature is the persistent L2ARC. So starting with OpenZFS 2.0, when your file server reboots, it no longer treats the L2ARC as empty, but is able to actually page in all of the previously written information in the L2ARC and recreate those pointers in memory so that you maintain your cache hit ratio out of the L2ARC even through a reboot. And then we'll be talking about some of the improvements to Resilver and how those can speed up the recovery of your system, as well as the new sequential rebuild feature, which, depending on your pool layout, can actually make the Resilver process be replaced by a rebuild process, which is much quicker. So, special allocation classes. These were originally designed as part of the DRAID feature, so distributed parity RAID. This was designed by Intel for a government supercomputer and was contributed to OpenZFS. One of the things DRAID does is use a fixed layout, unlike the dynamic layout used in regular RAID Z in ZFS. And this means that because the metadata and small blocks are small, and DRAID always has a fixed stripe width of the entire width of your vdev, that storing small blocks and metadata was expensive. There was a lot of overhead because you had this padding. So if the stripe width for a DRAID is, say, 64 kilobytes, then writing a 4 kilobyte file or bit of metadata would use that whole 64K. And so for DRAID, they wrote this special allocations class code that would say, if it's metadata or a small block like this, we're going to put it on this other vdev that will just be a mirror and will be very efficient at dealing with small blocks. And then our DRAID will be able to handle the large blocks. But this feature is generally usable, and you can use it on any type of pool, not just with DRAID. And the main reason we decide to do that is it allows us to move metadata to a faster class of device, whether that's our main pool is spinning Rust and we're moving the metadata to SSDs, or even our main pool is SSDs, but we need the metadata to be even faster, and so we're promoting that to NVMe or whatever level of tiering you happen to have. By moving the metadata, which is much smaller, but will boost your performance by being much faster, to a faster device, you get more performance. So some things to remember when you're using metadata vdevs. Each vdev is responsible for its own redundancy. So in a ZFS pool, when you run zpool status, you can see all of the vdevs that are part of a pool. And then inside of each of those vdevs, you'll see the disk that it's made up of. And that means that inside each vdev, all of the redundancy for that vdev is its own responsibility. So when you have two sets of mirrors, if one of the disks in the first vdev dies, the only other copy of that data is on the second disk in that same vdev, and that mirror has to resilver and recover itself. The other vdev has no information and nothing to contribute to the degraded vdev. So for metadata vdevs, that means that you must use mirrors. If you can make a single disk metadata vdev and that single disk fails, then all the metadata that was stored on that is no longer accessible, and your pool is not usable. So to prevent data loss, you want to make sure you mirror your metadata vdevs. Because if the metadata vdev is lost, then your pool is completely unusable. You should always mirror your special vdevs, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to use a 3-deep mirror rather than a normal 2-deep mirror. This is the metadata for your pool. It's higher impact than losing any other disk, because without the metadata, you won't even know what files you have, let alone where on the other disks they might actually be stored. So you definitely want to have a high level of redundancy on your metadata vdevs, because that's critical information in your system. And if possible, it wouldn't be a bad idea to stagger the devices that you use to make up the vdev to avoid them all wearing out at the same time, especially when you're using flash and there's limited write endurance. If all 3 devices in your 3-deep mirror have the same write endurance, and being a mirror, every time you write to one, you're writing to all of them, it means that they would all wear out at the same time. And if you can avoid that, it allows you to have more time to stagger the replacement. Any questions so far? So now, a common question we get is, how does adding a metadata vdev impact my already built pool? So when you add a new metadata allocation class vdev, it only impacts newly written data. So only as you add new data, as you either append to existing files or write new files or overwrite files, will the metadata for that stuff be written to the metadata vdev. So basically, after you add the vdev, any metadata written after that point will start being written to the metadata vdev, but any older files that haven't been modified will continue to have their metadata living where it was written originally. But as you write new stuff and as you overwrite existing files or modify existing files, then that metadata, the new versions, will be written to the new metadata vdev. If you want to force that process to happen more quickly, then you can use the ZFS send and receive system to basically copy all the data back to the pool itself. And as it's rewritten, all the metadata will be written to the new metadata vdev, and that can allow you to gain the advantage of the metadata vdev more quickly. So Jason from the chat asked what I meant by staggering the metadata vdev devices. There's a couple of different ways you can use non-identical devices that might have different wear leveling. Another thing you can do is, if you're going to go to a 3D mirror, don't add the third one until a week or two or some amount of time into the life of the pool, so that it won't be as worn out as the others. Or even offlining one of the devices for an amount of time so that it doesn't get worn as much, and then re-onlining it, let it catch up, but it will not have exhausted as much of its life. And you ideally hope to have the devices not wear out at the same time by staggering when you added them to the pool, or by using online and offline to take turns on which ones are active. Of course, while it's offline, it's not providing you the redundancy, so that's not always an easy thing to do. So if you need help with setting up metadata vdevs on your pool, or with any other ZFS or FreeBSD problems, if you head over to our website, klarasystems.com, and sign up for one of our support subscriptions, before the end of this month, 6-month contracts get 1 month free, and year contracts get 3 months free. So head over to klarasystems.com and sign up for our support subscription. So on to device selection. As we just discussed, it turns out that flash devices have limited write endurance, and they, after so many writes, will no longer be able to write new data. Some of these will manifest as just the device turning read-only, which in some cases is better than failing, but in some cases it will actually lead to write failures or the device just dying. And obviously you want to plan ahead for that. So the first part of planning ahead for dealing with a device wearing out is deciding what device to buy and determining what its write endurance is. So if you're adding a SLOG device to your pool, so this is the ZFS separate intent log, basically a device that holds synchronous writes while they're still being written back to the main pool storage, so that synchronous transactions like writes to a database can be confirmed as on stable storage more quickly than would be possible than writing them to the main pool, which might be spinning disks or something. So the first thing to know when you're buying a SLOG device is it doesn't need to be very large. It only holds data that ZFS has accepted from an application, but hasn't actually been safely written to the main pool yet. And it's basically used as a cache to hold that in case the system loses power or something before that gets safely written to the main part of the pool. In general, data is going to live in this SLOG device for less than 5 seconds. And so this device almost never needs to be bigger than 32 gigabytes. 16 gigabytes is probably enough. But it does need to be high endurance, because every synchronous write that you do to your pool is going to be written to this device first, and then flushed out to the main devices as part of the normal transaction group in ZFS. So that means, if you're doing a high load database, there's going to be a constant stream of writes going to this device, and it's going to be constantly overwriting the same bits of flash again and again, and that will eventually wear the device out. So we recommend aiming for a device that has an endurance of at least 5 drive writes per day. So that's enough endurance to overwrite the entire device, however big it happens to be, 5 times per day. Currently, when you're shopping for flash storage devices, usually come with a rating of either some number of drive writes per day over the course of the warranty period, 3 or 5 years or whatever, or just a number of terabytes written as their endurance. And you just want to make sure that you're going to be able to handle whatever load your pool has or will have in the future. Always assume that it's going to get busier. for whatever warranty period you expect this device to last for. So if the device isn't going to last, you either have to plan to replace it or buy a device that has a higher write endurance. Although with flash devices, it turns out small devices tend to have lower performance. Much of the performance from flash comes from spreading incoming writes out over multiple separate flash cells. So often in the same model series, a larger flash device will have a higher write performance and more IOPS and more write endurance. So often what that means for your SLOG device is buying a large device and basically under provisioning it, using only a small fraction of the device, but because it's large, you can get the performance and the endurance of the larger device. It wastes a bit of space, but in the end, you're going to wear out all the cells in the device. And so the larger one is just buying you more time before you have to replace it. The biggest feature you're looking for when shopping for a SLOG device is low latency. The entire point of the SLOG is to accelerate the latency of the write from your database application. So when a database or any other application that's doing a synchronous write does the write and flags it as synchronous, that asks ZFS, the file system, not to return and say that that write is complete until it's safe on storage and would survive a reboot or a crash. To do this, ZFS will write it to the SLOG as quickly as it can, and then say that it's safe. And then as it would with a normal asynchronous write for, say, copying a file, that data stays buffered in memory. And then as part of the next transaction group, it gets flushed out to the main storage. Once it's safely in the main storage, that block is overcome in the SLOG and is available to be used for something else. So the lower latency of your SLOG device will improve the transactions per second that your database or other application doing synchronous writes can do. So one option for a SLOG device is not to actually use a disk at all, but to use NVDIMMs. So that's non-volatile DIMMs. They're basically a step between the fastest disks, like NVMe, and the RAM in your computer. Basically RAM that's non-volatile, meaning that it retains its content through a reboot. And these tend to be available in about 16 and 32 gigabyte sizes currently. And so they make perfect SLOGs because they can write usually 5 to 10 or more gigabytes per second and have much lower latencies than even the fastest NVMe devices. For metadata Vdev, things are a bit different. Unlike a SLOG, a metadata Vdev also has to service a read workload. Right, with the SLOG, you're writing constantly and most times never reading the data back, because unless your system crashes, you already have that data in memory and you don't need to read it back from the SLOG. But in the case of a crash, you can read it back from the SLOG and replay those incompleted transactions. With a metadata Vdev, you're going to be writing to it every time there's a new metadata or a change in a file that's going to generate more metadata that needs to be written to the metadata Vdev. But you're also going to be reading heavily from this device. In particular, some more consumer-grade SSDs will run into a garbage collect pause. So if you write a lot to this disk very quickly, it might actually stall the reads while it basically does a garbage collection. So on an SSD, each flash cell has to be written completely. You're not actually addressing individual sectors like you were on a spinning disk. And so normally the SSD has more space than it actually advertises, and it can append your new writes, and then eventually it has to erase an entire cell and rewrite it with new information. If you're writing to the device too quickly on a device that can't support that, it will have to pause while it actually rewrites some data and does the internal housekeeping. One way to help mitigate this is using ZFS's auto trim feature. So this will have ZFS notify the SSD when any space on the device is freed. And when the SSD knows which space is free space, it knows it can write to it and it doesn't have to preserve the content of it. Whereas when the SSD does not know which space your file system is using and which has become free space over time, then it has to do this more expensive garbage collection in order to find space to write your new writes to. So trim can help mitigate the performance impact of a high write volume and make that cause slow reads. But how big does your metadata vdev need to be? That really depends on the number of files you have and what your block size is, and so on. So in general, a metadata vdev needs to be between 1% and 3% of the size of the pool, because that's about how much of ZFS's data is actually metadata. But if you have a lot of very small files or are using a large zvol with small record size or vol block size, then that will generate a higher portion of metadata. And so maybe even 5% metadata. But the same special vdev can be used to store small blocks as well. So if you just add a special vdev and don't reconfigure any of your data sets, then only metadata will be written to the metadata vdev. But on one or more data sets, you can set the small blocks property on that data set to a value, say 4K or 8K, and any blocks written to that data set that are that small or smaller will actually be written to the metadata vdev instead. And so one option you have is to buy a large set of metadata SSDs and then use them to also store the small blocks to use up the space. Because depending on the size of your pool, 3% of your pool might only require a rather small SSD for the metadata. And you can have multiple metadata vdevs. So you can, if your metadata vdev is getting full, you can just add some more. Although at some point you will run out of slots or connectors on your HPA or something to continue adding devices, but you can have more than one metadata vdev. And importantly, if you do fill your metadata vdev completely, nothing bad will happen. ZFS will just switch back to doing what it would do if you didn't have a metadata vdev and store the metadata on the main pool. You might start seeing a performance difference, but it won't actually cause anything bad to happen. But if you actually do fill your metadata vdev, it probably means it's time to add another set of SSDs as a metadata vdev, or to look at expanding the size of your existing metadata vdev. Then lastly, we have the L2ARC vdev. So the L2ARC is primarily a read cache. It's basically taking whatever data might have been written to the ARC, the ZFS adaptive replacement cache, which is kept in memory. And as in the background, ZFS is looking at this ordered list of what objects are in its cache, and it's using the objects that will soon be eliminated from the cache to make room for new things. And it will instead write those out to the L2ARC so that, and then replacing the data that's in the ARC with just a pointer saying, we still have this data in cache, it's in our second level cache over at this offset. This allows you to have more data in cache, but the second level cache is not nearly as fast as your main memory. But you still do need some write endurance on the L2ARC device. Basically, as ZFS is watching its main cache and looking at the items that will soon fall out and writing them to the L2ARC so that they can be eliminated and save that space in the ARC to support new cache data. It basically starts writing at the beginning of the L2ARC device and then goes through to the end, and then it starts at the beginning again and overwrites data. But the L2ARC does have a set of tunables to control rate limits on how quickly it will write to the L2ARC device. Part of the reason for this is because we're writing the device from beginning to end and then start over beginning to end, if you were doing an operation like, say, a backup, where you're going to read all the data in your entire pool, if we didn't have rate limits on the L2 arc, we would basically write all the data you're backing up to the L2 arc. And when it got full, we'd start at the beginning and overwrite the data. And most of that data, in the case of a backup, you're going to read once and not a second time. And so you've just, piped terabytes of data through your L2 arc device to no useful purpose. So by default, it will only write a few megabytes per second to the L2 arc, so that it's basically a cross section of what is falling out of your cache that gets written to the L2 arc. And then by looking at it, we determine which blocks are most frequently used, and we keep those hot in the main arc, and the L2 arc is our second chance. But it ends up being full of the data that we might still have a use for. But if you remember, when I said at the beginning, when data is written to the L2 arc, you're basically replacing data in the main cache with just taking that data, freeing it, writing it to the SSD and freeing it from memory, and replacing with just a smaller pointer saying that data that was in the cache is now in the second level cache instead. But that means that every block that we have on the L2 arc still takes up some memory in the main cache. If you make your L2 arc device too large, many terabytes on a pool that's not that big, or a system with not that much memory, then you can end up dominating most of your RAM cache, the fastest cache you have, with pointers to this slower cache. So you generally don't want your L2 arc to be too big compared to the amount of memory you have in the system, because caching 32 gigs of your most popular data in memory at this really, really high speed is usually going to be more impactful to performance than caching a terabyte of it to an SSD, but all of your memory is used up by having pointers to that data on the SSD, and not as much of it is actually cached in RAM. So any more questions? Well, then I'm going to go ahead and submit any other questions you have. But in the meantime, I will answer one that got posed to me the other day about how resilvering on ZFS works. So what is resilvering anyway? It's the term for rebuilding a RAID array, specifically. Originally, the etymology is for a mirror. So back in ye olden days, when a mirror was literally a glass with silver backing for the reflective surface, if over time the silver would tarnish and your mirror wouldn't work very well, and if you re-silvered the mirror by replacing the silver with new, the mirror would work well again. And so in the normal case of a hardware RAID mirror, this is after a device has failed and you've replaced the failed disk with a new one, we copy all the data off of the remaining disk to the new disk, so they will now both have the same content. And so in a normal hardware RAID, this happens by just starting at the beginning of the remaining disk and copying all that data to the new disk. ZFS is actually able to optimize this process. Because ZFS knows which blocks on the remaining disk actually contain data and which blocks of free space, ZFS can copy only the parts of the remaining disk that actually contain data to the replacement disk. ZFS also has the advantage of having the checksums of those data, so that it is actually able to tell if the copy on the remaining drive is damaged and knows not to copy the bad data. So on a partially full array, this theoretically allows ZFS to resilver much faster, because it only has to copy whatever percentage of data that matches how full your pool is. If you have a 100 terabyte pool and it only has 20 terabytes of data in it, you're only copying the data that was how full that drive was instead of the entire drive. So to accomplish this, ZFS starts at the top of its block tree with the Uber block. And this is the thing that gets written every time there's a transaction group. And that Uber block will point to various indirect blocks, which are just arrays of more blocks. And then you can have multiple levels of indirect blocks down to the actual data blocks. So in the new sequential healing resilver, what ZFS will do is start at the beginning of the pool and go through every object and then walk down its indirect blocks and find every data block and read it and check its checksum, make sure the data is correct. If not, heal it and repair it or flag it as broken, and then go on to the next. To improve the performance of this, since this can end up making the drive have to seek all over the drive to find this different bits of data, it can instead create a queue. So it starts walking through the block pointers and queuing up the next thing to do. Sorry, that came all out of order. So here we go. We'll start at the top at the Uber block and then go down to the indirect block and indirect block. And then now we found that there are these two data blocks. So we can actually read the data from those blocks, check the checksum, make sure it's good, and then go to the next one. Once we've read all the data blocks for this indirect block, we go to the next indirect block and continue on like that. Over and over. In the newer version, the sequential resilver that was introduced back in 2017, instead of doing all of this in that specific order, what it will do is when it finds a data block, it will add it to a list, a range tree, saying, all right, I know I need to scan these two blocks of the disk. And then it goes on and finds the next data block and the next data block. And it builds up this queue in memory up to a limit, which defaults to 600 megabytes of memory, or smaller depending on how much RAM your system has. Once that queue is full, it will take the largest contiguous range of blocks that need to be checked and go and do that. And then once that's complete, once all those reads have been done and the data has been repaired if it needed it, then it will continue back to the scanning mode where it will then keep finding more data blocks and adding them to this queue and then flushing out the largest chunk again. But for DRAID, they were able to pull off a different mode called a sequential rebuild. So this truly sequential rebuild was developed as part of the DRAID work that also brought us the Metadata Vdev. So rather than walking the tree of blocks to find out what data is allocated and what's not, DRAID uses just the space map. And so it knows which parts of the disk are full of data and which aren't, but it doesn't know the checksum or what file that data relates to. So if you're using DRAID or mirrors, then you can actually just, like a hardware RAID would do, start at the beginning of the disk and copy all the data through to the end. Although with ZFS, you also do get to skip the bits that aren't allocated. This doesn't work for RAID Z, and I'll explain why. So after you've done this, you've basically copied all the data from the one mirror to the second mirror. Unlike a regular resilver, you've not actually verified the checksums of all of that data. Now, in the case of a mirror where you only had one other disk, that's not really a big deal because you wouldn't have anywhere else to regenerate the data from if the copy on the remaining mirror was damaged anyway. But because you're using only the space map, you don't have access to the metadata or the checksum. So we do this sequential rebuild as quickly as possible to get your devices back online. And then it does the regular resilver that we described a minute ago to go through and now verify all those checksums. So we do the rebuild once in device order, to copy all the data as quickly as possible to get the most performance out of the device. And then we do a second scan in object order where we can actually verify all the checksums and make sure the data is correct. The advantage of doing these, even though in the end this is more work, the first rebuild step will complete much more quickly, and that leaves you much less in danger of another device failing in the meantime and exceeding the level of redundancy you have and having to and losing the entire pool because you've lost too many devices at once. So any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much for attending our webinar here on the latest features in ZFS and for the questions that you were able to ask. So if you have any more questions, you can feel free to contact us. And remember that until the end of September, if you sign up for one of our ZFS or FreeBSD support subscriptions, you can get some months free. And remember to follow us on Twitter at Klara Inc. Thank you.